joining us this morning to talk about 60 Minutes from this past weekend. They are Robert Anderson, producer, and correspondent Mike Wallace. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for joining us. We watched 60 Minutes on Sunday, the double segment, the interview with President Jiang, and we replayed it last night, including the whole hour interview that you did in China. Welcome back to the program, first of all, and Mr. Anderson, wanted to ask you how you got the interview. It's very rare to see the President of China on American TV.
We'd been trying to get it for several years, and the reason we got it this time was because the Chinese wanted to get across to the United States that they feel they've been misunderstood. They feel they've been demonized, and they're ready to try a blitz on the United States to try to get their points across about what kind of government they have and how satisfied they say their people are with it. So the timing was really one that they decided upon, which played into our hand beautifully.
Bob had said just before we went on the air, he said, here we are, a couple of agents of public relations for the People's Republic of China. Actually, what they do have in mind in this interview, and then in the cultural onslaught that's currently going on in the United States, with the variety of cultural affairs that they have launched, they do want to have Americans have what they believe should be a better understanding of the People's Republic of China.
Mr. Wallace, why now? Why did he agree to it at this particular time, do you think?
Lost it again.
I think it was tied to the fact that now they're coming to the United Nations. They've got this cultural exhibit that's going to be in a half-dozen American cities, and they have an information minister, Minister Zhao, who is very hip to this stuff, and he, I think, personally convinced the president to do our interview and also to take on American public opinion.
Mr. Anderson, Mr. Wallace may be having problems hearing us, so hopefully we'll be able to work out the problem. Maybe you can transfer some of the questions that we get from our callers. We do want to put the phone numbers on the bottom of the screen. We'll take calls from Republicans, Democrats, and from others during this segment. Last about 45 minutes. We're going to talk with the two folks who put together the piece for 60 Minutes over the weekend. Once again, we ran the double segment last night in prime time, and then the hour-long segment following that. So we're going to use this opportunity to learn not just about China, but a lot about journalism and how 60 Minutes goes about its business. So there are the phone numbers on the bottom of the screen, and I'll ask you folks up in New York, talk to us about logistics. How did you find out that this was a go, and what happened after that?
Minister Zhao, who is the information minister of China, came to the United States about a month, 6 weeks ago, and sat down with Bob and me and said, in effect, chances are we may be able to arrange for this interview after all. As Bob said, we'd been after it for a couple of years. And by the time we got through talking with Minister Zhao, who is a very knowledgeable fellow and very close to the president, from what we understand, he said, I'm going back and recommend it. And about a week later, I guess it was, that we got word from Beijing, come on.
Were there any ground rules laid out by the Chinese?
There weren't any specific ground rules, but we were in constant negotiation with them over time. We wanted more time for the interview, and at the same time we wanted his answers to be shorter so that we could cover more ground. We'd seen the president do a couple of other interviews over the years, and his answers were usually very long, very stiff, spouting the party line, and what we wanted was more of a conversation. And Minister Zhao convinced the president to speak to us that way, and in fact, when the minister started calling this a dialogue, we knew that we were on the right track.
Mr. Wallace, that led to a moment of humor in the interview that we saw last night. Tell us more about that moment and what this president is like.
Well, first of all, this president is a fascinating fellow. He really is, and remarkably easy to talk to. He opens himself to you, which is hardly what the stereotype is of a dictator or dictatorial leaders, authoritarian leaders. He was easier to talk to. I'd interviewed Deng Xiaoping back in 1986, and he was very pleasant and so forth, but We were told no questions about politics, no political questions whatsoever. Economic questions, by all means. And this fellow just seemed to be having a very good time. Bob had sent a couple of interviews that had been on C-SPAN in addition to 60 Minutes, one with Rafsanjani, who was running Iran at the time, and with Andres Pastrana, who was running Colombia. And I think that somebody must have studied the way they handled it, because Rafsanjani was smiling, Pastrana was smiling, Jiang Zemin was smiling during some of the most difficult questions.
We were told that the president was struck when he looked at the Rafsanjani interview at how Rafsanjani smiled through Mike's toughest questions. And he thought that that made Rafsanjani look warm and friendly. And since the president was out to charm us and charm the American people in this interview, he made the calculated decision to put on his smiling face. And if you look at the interview, you'll notice that he's chuckling throughout.
We have lots of calls coming in from around the country for Mike Wallace and Robert Anderson of 60 Minutes. We're going to go to Bel Air, Maryland first on the Democrats line. Good morning, Bel Air.
Good morning. Mr. Wallace.
Sir.
I watched your program, and I was struck by what I consider kind of sloppy nomenclature. You mentioned that Wen Ho Lee was a spy. And, of course, he has not been accused of espionage. He's been accused of mishandling or downloading information. I might point out that John Deutsch, former head of the CIA, did the same thing, and the only thing that happened to him was that his security clearance was removed.
Thank you. Mr. Wallace.
I think that you didn't listen carefully enough. I know Wen Ho Lee a little bit. We did a profile of Wen Ho Lee on 60 Minutes at the time that he was first accused of espionage by the New York Times. And when I say first accused by the New York Times, they reported that story that certain people in Washington had suggested that he was guilty of espionage. In any case, I'm not sure the point that you're making, except that I agree with you. John Deutsch and Wen Ho Lee are apparently guilty of exactly the same thing. They are being treated totally differently.
Which was the point you made in the Wen Ho Lee piece that you did.
Right.
Let's go to Jordan in Minnesota, Republican line. Hello.
Hello?
Hello, Jordan.
Hi. I'm really concerned about the fact that we didn't get to one of the heart of the issues between us and China, and that is their designs on Taiwan. And frankly, the Red Army paper, the PLA paper from March, which outlined in detail how they intended to launch their attack utilizing neutron bombs, the technology they've stolen from us, and apparently they're not apparently afraid to mention that technology, and a rather smug complacency about their ability to neutralize the U.S. 7th Fleet. Those kinds of things are alarming to Americans, especially when we're being told by the Clinton-Gore administration that we're as strong as ever.
Thank you. Taiwan, gentlemen.
Taiwan definitely is a flashpoint, a key issue, and Mike talked to the president about Taiwan in an earlier part of the interview, which was outside. And there was a big fountain outside, so the sound wasn't terrific, but it didn't make the piece because the president really had nothing new to say about Taiwan.
Taiwan, we could have talked for 20 minutes and made absolutely no news talking about Taiwan. What the president said was, look, I'm happy to fly to Taipei, to Taiwan. I'll go to Taipei to sit down and talk with them, but all they have to do ahead of time is acknowledge the fact of one China. And Taipei, Taiwan, does not acknowledge that. And it seemed foolish to waste time on the subject of Taiwan to get the same old boilerplate that we have been getting over a period of a couple of decades.
We're going to spend about 40 minutes left, 40 minutes more with our guests. We'll continue to take calls. Folks, you mentioned being outside of the interview area for a brief time. You were not in Beijing, right? You were in another part of the country, correct?
We were in Beidaihe. Beidaihe is a I'm reluctant to say, it's a kind of an interesting, tacky resort town on the Yellow Sea, about 200 miles north of Beijing. But in the off to one side of it, so to speak, but on the water, is a 3 square kilometer compound, which is the summer digs of the people in charge in China. And it's a very elaborate, very attractive place where they go each August to swim and to talk and to plan what's coming up over the next year. It was the first time, by the way, that Western television cameras had ever been permitted inside Bidaiha.
The Bidaiha complex is called their Camp David, but it also has another name that was more interesting to us. It's called China's smoke-filled room, because as Mike says, it's where the leaders meet in private to map out their plans for the upcoming year.
Let's go to Tacoma, Washington. Independent caller, you're on with Robert Anderson and Mike Wallace. Hello.
Hello. Yes, Mr. Wallace. I have a question for you. I have not seen the complete interview. I did see your 60-minute segment, but I wanted to know if Premier Zhao had made any reference to you in the interview about what the American armed forces did at Kent State during the crisis there with Vietnam. And also the other question was, did Zhao bring up anything concerning the agreement at Cairo in World War II, which gave to China the territory of Taiwan, which was then Formosa, which they admitted that it was part of it. And of course, later on, as you know, we did recognize Formosa as China.
All right. Thanks a lot, Mr. Wallace.
Nothing about either question that you've raised or point that you have raised was in our discussion at all.
I think that's because the president said at the beginning and again at the end in English that the purpose of this interview to him was to increase America's understanding about China. And when Mike asked him about American relations with China and whether he viewed America as power mad and a threat to world peace, as the China Daily had said at one point when Secretary Cohen was over there, the president said, well, America's a bit full of itself, but if you don't mind, I want to say friendly things today, so I don't want to use many tough words. And I think that's why things like Kent State did not come up.
The president spoke part in English and part in Chinese. Why was that?
He has very good English. He has remarkable command of English. We were very surprised about it. And I think that he did it to show the American people that he had thought about and studied English, America, talked about Jefferson, talked about Abraham Lincoln, even succeeded in, once again, quoting part of the Gettysburg Address in English. He understands a lot more English. On one occasion, he said he wasn't very happy with a question that I'd asked, and he said, I don't need any translation. I know what you're saying.
Let's go to Tampa, Florida. Democrats line. Hello.
Good morning, John. Yeah, Mike, I know what he was referring to when you referred to his conscience. He's supposed to answer his conscience problem. Did he feel like that young man was right to do that? Would he had done that when he was a young man? You know, Mike, you guys in the news media, you act like you were elected to something. Your demeanor with him to the president of a country with 1.25 billion people, when you shaking your finger and you laughed at it, but that's very rude for a reporter to do that. No wonder they don't want to give you interviews. You could work for Fox Station.
Thanks, Mike.
One more thing.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
One more thing.
Yeah.
You know, I would trade today a one-party system that they got for this stupid thing we got that doesn't get done year after year after year.
Mike Wallace.
Well, if you want to elect Bill Clinton or George Bush or Al Gore King, well, you go right ahead and do it. He was not the least bit offended by when I said, can you imagine I'm shaking my finger at the president of China. We talked as civilized men talking about something that interested him and interested us. And it was as simple as that. And a lot more of that, I think, would be a good idea in relations between reporters and leaders, because that way you're going to learn a good deal more about what goes on in the mind of leaders who have so much power around the world.
It pushes them beyond boilerplate. That's why you get more out of it, I think.
That's right.
Mr. Anderson, talk a little bit about logistics. Who went to China with you? How many people were involved?
I can hear you.
Yeah.
We had 2 camera crews, 2 cameramen, 2 sound people, an associate producer, Mike, and me. And we had a very important man who had acted as an intermediary between us and the Chinese. And that was our group.
Were you escorted by the government in any way?
We were helped by the government to get from place to place, but no, we didn't feel that we were under a microscope or that our movements were at all restricted. We were basically at this beach resort working, preparing questions, preparing for the interview.
Of course, we did. I remember when we got into our rooms, we were supposed to stay at a hotel to begin with, and then they moved us to a diplomatic mission. And as soon as we got into the room, we started talking to the chandelier to make them aware of the fact that conceivably they were listening to us. But it couldn't have been, in our experience, it couldn't have been more relaxed.
We move on to the state of Idaho. Rexburg, Idaho, Republican caller for Robert Anderson and Mike Wallace. Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
As mentioned earlier, President Jiang's purpose in allowing the interview was to promote understanding between the Chinese and Americans. I, for one, had strong negative opinions towards the Chinese government, and through this interview, my opinion was softened, and President Jiang's purpose was achieved with me, and I hope it was with other Americans. I came to understand better why they do things the way they do them, and as President Jiang I hope that understanding and friendship is strengthened and increased between the Americans and Chinese.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me add to that, though. I don't know if you saw the Washington Times today, but there's a screaming headline, a banner headline that says Chinese religious rights are deteriorated. This is a report from the administration, and it says respect for religious freedom in China deteriorated markedly during the last half of last year with the brutal suppression of minority faiths such as Falun Gong. This is according to an administration report. What do you make of that? What would the president of China, if you presented that with him, what would he say about a report like that?
He would probably say that we don't understand sufficiently. Both Bob and I find it difficult to understand why China is persecuting, and they are, Falun Gong. What in the world worries them so much about Falun Gong? The president, for those of you who saw the broadcast last night, the president went on at some length about the fact that it was an evil cult. It was very, very difficult for me to understand fully what he meant. Look, there is no such thing as free religion in China. There is Christianity, there is Catholicism, there are a variety of other religions, but they are have to be okayed by the Chinese. So it's a Chinese version of Christianity that gets the okay, and if you don't go along with them, then they'll throw you in jail.
In that report, I think the State Department man in charge of religious freedom and religious rights got it right when he said that the Chinese control what they don't understand and what they fear they might not be able to control. That's what draws their attention. And President Jiang was supposedly the man who decided on the crackdown on Falun Gong, and I think it's believed that part of that reason is because the government doesn't feel that it can control it very well, and therefore feels it has to try all the harder to control it, doesn't quite understand it. The key word that the president kept mentioning over and over and over was stability. And stability cut back to us to one-party rule, and our view going over there was one-party rule must simply be their way of holding on to power. That's why they like it. And what the president kept trying to get across was it's not about holding on to power, it's about holding the country together, holding this 1.26 billion people together. And that's where, when there's a religion he doesn't understand that seems to be spreading, they're particularly quick to want to quash it or at least bring it under control.
Just about a half hour left with our two guests, Robert Anderson and Mike Wallace of CBS's 60 Minutes. They're talking about the interview conducted, was it last week, gentlemen?
2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago, which aired Sunday on 60 Minutes, and we replayed the 60 Minutes segment, the cut-down version, and then the full interview. So we'll take more of your calls for our guests. East Moline, Illinois, you're up.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's a pleasure to talk to you, Mr. Wallace, and the other gentleman. I can't remember your name. I'm sorry.
Robert Anderson.
Robert Anderson. The reason I called was about religious repression in China. I've been watching for 2 hours now this morning, waiting for you to come on. And I caught a little bit of your interview with President Jiang this morning, and I was a little upset, you know, that he was being so humorous and trying to make his government seem more civilized because they watch Forrest Gump and whatever, when in fact many religious faiths are in prison and suffering, one of which is my faith, Jehovah's Witnesses. It's in the report in the newspaper article the gentleman showed earlier, it said minority faiths were mostly in prison there, when in fact Jehovah's Witnesses is a large religious faith, and they are growing rapidly by 1,000 a day, and they have been in prison for many years there. And I'd like, to know what the government, might be saying to President Jiang about these human rights, that they're not, they're trying to make themselves look more civilized, and I'm sure the Chinese people are very wonderful people, but the government is persecuting people of all sorts of religious faiths.
All right, thanks a lot, Illinois.
Well, again, as we said in the piece, foreign missionaries are not allowed. Evangelical movements are not allowed to proselytize. They really do, as Mike said, have their approved religions, but it's a short list, and if you're going to get on it, you have to submit to government rules and controls.
Face it, it is an authoritarian. There was a long discussion. It is a dictatorship, in effect, there. And that they do not want free religions. They are, when you think about it, and you try to think about it from their point of view, here's 1.3 billion people, and that's spread over this huge area, run by a remarkably small group of major leaders, when you think about it, in Beijing. And they want to keep control. They want to keep control of China. And if something like Falun Gong shows up and suddenly they can, at the drop of a hat, get 10,000 or 20,000 or 30,000 people demonstrating, and it's not violent demonstration by any means. They're praying or they're doing exercises. It worries. I think they have great difficulty in the Chinese leadership trying to understand what in the world these people are after.
A little bit more on logistics, because you did show some members of Falun Gong and other drops of video within the piece that you did. Where do pictures like that come from? We saw some arrests, a little bit of violence, I think on Tiananmen Square.
That's correct. That's right.
Not only from 10 years back, but from more recently. Where do pictures like that come from? How do you get them?
We got the Falun Gong arrest pictures from our bureau. Falun Gong still has protesters that take to the square, I think, weekly, if not almost daily. And they do it to get arrested. They realize that that's going to happen to them, but they do it to make the point that they're still there and they're not going to be suppressed. And there are people that are also there with cameras hidden in bags and things, I think, to take these pictures.
Incidentally, the Falun Gong people have taken out a full-page ad in the New York Times today, which I saw coming in. And what they're saying to President Jiang is that while he is here, and they're demonstrating outside the United Nations here as well, what they're saying to President Jiang is, look, why don't you sit down and talk to us? I'm sure he's not going to. Why don't you come and sit down and talk to us, see what is on our mind? We have no intention, in effect, they're saying, of trying to overthrow the government of the People's Republic of China. This is our religion. This is our belief.
Here is that open letter, by the way, in the New York Times. It's a full-page open letter to Jiang's main president of China, Stop the Violence in China, and it's submitted by U.S. Falun Gong practitioners and friends of Falun Gong. We could take a look at that full-page ad in the New York Times, an open letter. Penland, Pennsylvania, our next call. Democrats line. Hello.
Yes, sir. Good morning. Mine is not really in the form of a question. It's a comment I'd like to make. I'd like to thank CBS and C-SPAN for allowing the American people to witness the interview between Mike Wallace and President Jiang Zemin. It was so instructive. I taped both the 60-minute portion on Sunday evening and the entire interview last night. And I have to admit that I am an old fan of Mike Wallace to begin with, and I can't imagine that we could have sent anybody over there who could have done a more magnificent job. I must say, Mike, I'm watching you on television this morning. I don't know what it is you're taking in the way of pills, but you look younger every time I see you. And you just stay in there. God bless you. We need you. And you were as charming as President Jiang Zemin was. I'd like to just close with this one comment. Sooner or later, the matter involving Taiwan being part of China is going to have to be settled in China's favor, because it, in fact, is part of China. And sooner or later, I think the people of the United States, as well as the people of Taiwan, will recognize that. And I think that this will go a long way to producing peace in that part of the world that all of us seek. So, Mike, again, thank you so very much for allowing us to be part of this great and historic event. I'll treasure it forever.
Thank you. We'll let you take it from there, Mr. Wallace, if you'd like.
You can imagine.
Couldn't agree with him more.
How much time did you spend in China overall to do the interview?
About...
We were there for 6 nights, 6 days.
Yeah.
One in Beijing, the rest in Badaiha. You know, it's not blowing smoke. We should mention that C-SPAN was very important to us in getting the interview.
That's right.
Because the Chinese are loath to be edited. And they feel that invariably when they are edited, they're taken out of context, their words are twisted. And if we were going to get the kind of time we wanted from the president, he needed to be reassured that while we did our piece or pieces on 60 Minutes, the whole interview would be seen on C-SPAN. And the fact that he could count on that kind of airtime, I think really pushed us over the top, not just in getting the interview, but in our negotiations with them about how long the interview could be.
How long was the interview total?
About 3 hours.
And what we got from you was, I think, a tape that was about an hour, because we had, it was simultaneous translation.
No, consecutive.
Consecutive translation.
Right, between consecutive translation and the tape changes and breaks between tapes, the actual interview would have been about an hour, while it took about 3 hours to do.
The other thing that I found interesting in what the gentleman was talking about, too, Bob and I suggested this to the management of CBS News a couple of years ago, 3-4 years ago, I guess, when we were going to talk with President Rafsanjani of Iran. And it seems a pity to have this large hour and a half of talk and be confined to maybe 15 minutes of it on 60 Minutes. What happens to the rest of it? And so the two of us went to Andrew Hayward, the president of CBS News, and said, Andrew, what about it? Why don't we offer it to C-SPAN? He thought it was a wonderful idea. And so we did that with Rafsanjani, we did it with Andres Pastrana, and now with Jiang Zemin. When I did an interview with Deng Xiaoping many years ago, in 1986, I think we got, I'm ashamed to say, maybe 1/10 of the time of the whole interview. And it was just wrong, in my estimation, for the American people not to see more, to try to understand the fiber, to try to understand the dimensions of these world leaders who want to get their points across and should have their points across.
Here is a question. I'll give this to you, Mr. Anderson, from one of our viewers. Who made the camera cut decisions on the, quote, unedited version of the interview, and who did the translation? Tell us about how the translation worked.
The translation was quite complex, actually, because the Chinese provided their own translation at the time. It was their interpreter. Then, after the fact, they went back and came up with what they called their official transcript of what the president said or meant to say, or wanted to say but didn't quite say. And then we brought in an interpreter who had no editorial bias one way or the other to go through it line by line and word by word and really give us an exact translation. And by melding that together, we came up with what we felt was as pure and accurate as we could possibly make it.
And did they approach you after the interview in any way to reshape anything, if for lack of a better term?
No, they didn't, but one point that they made and that we made in the piece was they didn't want us to use any pictures of the violence at Tiananmen Square, because they said this was before President Jiang's time, and if you put violence pictures on it, it makes a connection between the president and the violence that frankly didn't exist. And we explained that in not using pictures of the violence in our piece. However, there was that, I thought, fascinating exchange between Mike and the president on the subject of the man in front of the tank. And the questions were not about the tank, they were about how the president felt about the man, just as we asked the president about the students demonstrating for democracy and freedom and against corruption. Well, the Chinese had no problems with the discussion about democracy and freedom and against corruption, but they were very upset with us for using pictures of the man in front of the tank.
Mr. Wallace, tell us more about that moment when you tried to get the president to answer that question about whether that young man showed courage. You kept going after him on that question.
Mm-hmm. And he didn't want to answer it. And finally he said, I know what you're driving at. And he did. He is not an unsophisticated man. I've got to believe that he had immense admiration. Let me amend that. I've got to believe that he had understandable admiration for a young man who'll stand in front of that big tank. And you had to feel, here's this unavailing young person. And it really did speak to dictatorship in China. And he acknowledged that he himself had been a student protester back in his Shanghai days when they were talking about, and this is before he joined the Communist Party, when they were talking about we want peace, we want freedom, we want democracy. They didn't say peace. We want freedom, we want democracy. Well, they got what they believed to be freedom and democracy. It is not our understanding of freedom of democracy, but they succeeded in making a revolution. You know, you suddenly understand this is only 50 years old, this government. There have only been 3 leaders, Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and Jiang Zemin. Only 50 years. And one has to believe that they went about it differently from the Russians. The Russians brought freedom, religious freedom, press freedom, and so forth, perestroika. But they didn't do anything about their economy. And some less than responsible robber barons took charge of the economy in Russia. I think probably, and we've never talked about this with Jiang Zemin, I think probably the Chinese have thought, well, we're going to hold on politically. We're going to free up the economy, and we'll take charge of that economy, but we're going to free up that economy and give an opportunity for people to, as Deng Xiaoping said, to get rich is glorious. But we are not going to go through what has happened in Russia, where all of a sudden you go from strict communism to perestroika.
I think that cuts back again to the word stability, which he kept using to say that one-party rule, stability, will help prosperity, will bring prosperity a lot faster than if there is any kind of chaos. And another cultural difference that we noticed was when you mentioned the word dictator, and you today said, yes, he is a dictator by our definition, no question. But he really bristled at that word because by their definition, he's not. They take dictator to mean something really off the graph like a Hitler or a Stalin. And their view of their government is that, in fact, it isn't power mad, but it's altruistically trying to bring the country up. And there, the definitions of dictator cross.
Let's get some more of those phone calls in for our guest. Los Angeles Republican caller, you're on with Robert Anderson and Mike Wallace. Hello.
Hello, Mr. Wallace.
at 6:45 in the morning out there.
Hi. I'd like to ask you, how come you didn't ask the president of China about, we were involved with North Korea, a war with North Korea, and with Vietnam, and they were involved in both of these conflicts. We lost prisoners of war to the Soviets after World War II. We still never recovered some of our prisoners from the Korean War and the Vietnam. I'd like to make another statement. I was really affected the way the president veiled his threats, that China is like 5,000 years old, has 5,000 years of history, and like they're telling you that we are a new nation and a young nation, and more or less basically we should mind our P's and Q's, because basically when they get their weapons from developed from the technologies that was acquired through us, and like the Japanese did in World War II, they dropped the scrap metal we sold to them. Now they're going to drop the technology back on us like the Japanese did at Pearl Harbor, like they're going to do in a future Pearl Harbor to us.
Thanks. Let's get a response.
Eye of the beholder. You got something out of that interview that I simply did not get. I didn't get any sense of threat. I did get a sense of pride in China. But he has said that they have, and he told us, we didn't use it on the piece, that they have a really remarkably, comparatively small nuclear capability in China. We didn't get, you know, when you do an interview of this kind, and you're only going to be given, originally they said an hour and a half, and with the consecutive translation that was going to be 45 minutes, you've got to choose what questions you're going to ask, what areas you're going to get into. If you had all day to do it, that's a different story. And so certain things that you would like to have seen us ask, it had occurred to us, but Bob and I sit there and we figure out what is it that we're going to ask this gentleman.
We really felt from the first question on that the clock was ticking, and we didn't know when it was going to run out. At about the 2-hour mark, the foreign ministry people who were in the room were beating on the heads, figuratively, of the information ministry people, sending them over to me to say, interrupt, time's up, really, the interview has to stop, because Mike's questions seemed to be getting tougher, and their pleasure with this interview seemed to be waning quickly, and they wanted us to stop the interview. But fortunately, the president, as Mike said, seemed to be having a good time, so we were able to keep going for almost another hour. And it really, obviously we could have days worth of questions, but we had to prioritize.
And incidentally, immediately after, or almost immediately after the interview, we had been, Bob and I, invited to have dinner with the president. And at the dinner, the foreign minister showed up, and our former ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Li from China, and the Minister of Information and so forth. And it was quite apparent, even then, that the foreign minister was, he was satisfied that his man, President Jiang, had done a very good job. During the course of that dinner, they fed us moderately good food, some beer and some things. And suddenly, Jiang, who knows he considers himself an intellectual, and indeed he is, we began to talk about opera for some reason, and suddenly he burst into song, singing O Sole Mio. And not to be outdone, I joined in, and we entertained the table. I guess we entertained the table.
It was an odd couple duet.
Of O Sole Mio.
Let's move on to Charlotte, North Carolina. Good morning.
Good morning. I have a comment on the Falun Gong. I think at the beginning, I have the same opinion with everybody here, that I understand that the government is doing wrong to crack down, but actually what Falun Gong do, and another angle is they're teaching a different philosophy. The way they teach you is, for instance, my mother is she participant in Falun Gong. And when she, at the beginning, she got the symptom on the colon cancer, the Falun Gong, the people over there, they teach my mother, when you get sick, you don't go to see the doctor. You don't need to go to hospital. You don't need to check up on anything. So my mother was delayed for 4 months for, just for find out the cancer. By the time she found out, it was in late stage, which is stage 3. And after she had an operation, and she doesn't have too much time left now.
Caller, thanks for sharing that situation.
That's, I surely sympathize with that. Christian Science here in the United States feels the same way, do they not? Do we throw Christian Scientists in jail because of that?
Did you folks touch on the Olympics at all? There are a couple stories in the papers today, one in the Wall Street Journal talking about how Beijing, which lost the Olympics for this year, is looking to gain the Olympics in 2008, and there's a list of lots of things they're trying to do. Did that come up at all?
It did not. We read just before we came in here, I hadn't seen it until this morning, business about certain Chinese athletes not permitted to go to Sydney because they were involved with taking, I guess, anabolic steroids or something of that sort. They're very anxious to get the next Olympics, and so I think they're trying to stay out of harm's path. Therefore, it wasn't that these athletes decided on their own that they weren't going to Sydney. I would imagine the government said, you stay home.
Down to about 10 minutes left for the segment. Placitas, New Mexico, Democrats line. Go right ahead.
Good morning, gentlemen. How are you?
Good. And you?
I have a statement and then a question, real quick. The idea that any one of the 3 administrations, or should I say dictatorships in China, are not responsible for the violence of the previous one, nor should be associated with them, is ridiculous. They have continually violated human rights regardless of who is in power.
Mm-hmm.
Second, did anybody there in the interview feel, when they were speaking with Mr. Zemin, that he was handing them a political line or acting as though everything was scripted and all of his answers were predetermined long before he showed up? Did you feel as though you were being asked to accept something he did not believe or feel?
Thank you.
I don't think we were getting anything he didn't believe or feel, and I do think we were getting the party line because he represents the party. But again, in this negotiation that we had with them prior to the interview, we made the point that we didn't want these long, pre-written questions and a lack of spontaneity. And on the day before the interview, even though we'd spent weeks discussing topics, not specific questions because we don't do that, but topics that we'd be interested in, on the day before the interview, the president let it be known that he would take any question on any topic. He understood the desire for spontaneity, and he was open to it. So while we probably didn't ask him a lot of questions he hadn't answered before, I think his way of answering this time was different.
It's always interesting for our viewers to learn about the process once you get back home with the tape and the sound and how you put a piece together and the relationship between the correspondent and the producer. Explain for us how it comes together.
Well, the relationship between the correspondent and the producer has been described, I think, by the late Eric Severide. I'm not sure that I have this right. That the producer is the dog and the correspondent is the tree.
I like that. It's very collegial. We work on it together. We have a general sense of what we think are the most interesting or important parts of the interview, and we try to put them together in an order that makes sense. And a lot of it's just common sense, but we work on it together.
Bob and I have been around the world to a certain degree, doing a lot of interviews, and you learn to put up with the foibles of your colleague.
Let's move on to Fort Lee, New Jersey. Republican line, hello. Fort Lee? Go ahead, Fort Lee.
Hello?
Yes, sir, go ahead.
Mike Wallace?
Yes, sir.
I would like to congratulate you as a Cuban American for you to have the courage. I mean, for me, is to have the courage to be in the front of a Prime Minister of China and ask all those questions. I would like to see if you can do the same thing to our Fidel Castro to tell if that there is a dictatorship and ask all those questions that you did to the First Minister of China.
Thank you. What about Fidel Castro?
Well, the first time I interviewed Fidel Castro was when he came to New York, I guess it was 1959, and stayed at the Teresa Hotel. And I was working not at CBS at the time, I was working on Channel 13 locally here in New York. And he was talking about free elections in Cuba. He hadn't really declared himself a communist yet. Talking about free elections in Cuba, and he and his colleagues were cooking chicken in the halls of the Teresa Hotel up in Harlem. And I have reminded Fidel about this on one or two occasions when I've seen him since, and he has the slight memory of that. I would love to have that opportunity to do that once again with Fidel.
Mr. Anderson, are there any names, other names on your mind, people you'd like to get that you haven't had on yet?
Perhaps President Fujimori would be interesting to get. We're constantly kicking names around.
You know who? The Pope. The Pope would be a fascinating interview. Not necessarily as the Pope of the Catholic Church, but I mean, when you think about this man, athlete, actor, poet, playwright, and he knows so much and it has such courage, and to be able to talk to him as a man, not just as the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, that could be fascinating.
Let's get a call from Seaford, Delaware. Go right ahead.
Hello. I'd just like to ask Chris or mention that China has been in existence over 4,000 years without a formal religion. And they seem to have avoided the problems of the Crusades and the Inquisition and Muslim versus Christian in Kosovo, the religious right in the United States recently. I just don't understand why you don't understand that they avoid a lot of problems this way.
All right, thanks.
Back when the caller was talking about, previous caller was talking about blunt questions, I think Mike's bluntest one was when he said, if you upset Father, Father will take care of you, and moved his hand like that, and the sound man looked over at me and whispered, how are we getting home?
Jiang Zemin said to me, in effect, I am a proud atheist. Because he when he got the job, when Deng Xiaoping picked him to follow him, and Jiang Zemin is quoted as saying, I feel that I'm on thin ice. And then he said, with God's help. And so I asked him, I don't remember, it wasn't on camera, I don't believe, maybe it was. And he said, and I said, what do you mean, who is your God? And he said, well, I'm an atheist, and as I remember, he didn't say much more than that, Bob.
No, and he said that he hadn't said with God's help. One of the things that made it hard to prepare for this interview was there isn't a heck of a lot of history about Jiang Zemin that's out there, and there are a lot of quotes that are attributed to him that aren't necessarily correct. So we had to hack our way through the quotes that he thought were and the quotes that he thought weren't.
Here is another viewpoint from someone who faxed this message into us, saying that Hitler used the press just like this while planning world domination. You are being used in helping the U.S. be set up for their gain, not the world's. What do you think of that?
I think we've explained that we were aware of how they wanted to use us, and we felt we got a lot of information out of it.
La Follette, Tennessee, Democrats line. Hello.
Hello.
Go right ahead.
Yes, sir. I'd like to comment on Mac there. He done a fantastic job last night, and I really appreciate him. Just keep up the good work, Mac.
Thank you very much, sir.
Let's go right on to New York City. Republican line. Hello.
Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, gentlemen. About 12 years ago, I was in China myself on Easter Sunday, and I had asked the tour guide with us if I could go to Mass. I had the name of the cathedral, and I had to get the times of the masses because the books I read said they changed. The tour guide said, instead of getting back to me on the tour, he stood up at the front of the bus and announced that instead of going to Tiananmen Square, we'd all be going to Catholic Church, because at that time, 9:30 was the only mass when we were supposed to be at Tiananmen Square. So, of course, I had to say I didn't mean for the whole bus to go. I wanted the early morning mass at 6 or 6:30. He said, no, there weren't any. So the next morning I got up early and went down to the desk and had the tour guide, not the tour guide, the desk people, write a little note in Chinese telling a cab driver I would like to go to this cathedral because to me it was Easter Sunday. I should at least make a trip to the church. When I got to the cathedral at 6:30 in the morning, it was so mobbed, and it was a giant cathedral, I could not even see the altar.
Final thought, folks. We're just about out of time. Mr. Anderson or Mr. Wallace?
What is your final thought?
I was fascinated to have the opportunity to talk to this man. Look, there's nothing but good. Talk to this man. Look, there's nothing but good that can come out of the understanding of talking to a world leader who is willing to lay it on the line, answer questions. I found him a fascinating person.
We hope that it was as instructive for you as it was for us, and that when you see our pieces and compare it to the whole interview, you'll learn a lot about the process.
Robert Anderson, producer at 60 Minutes. Mike Wallace, correspondent. Thanks again for your time. We hope you come back again soon.
Thanks, Paul.
All right, appreciate it. And we appreciate everybody for calling. What we're going to do now is stay in New York, actually, go to the United Nations, where we're going to have some live coverage today of the Millennium Summit.
For more solutions in which all sides can claim a measure of victory and move away from choices in which someone is required to accept complete defeat. That will require us to develop greater sensitivity to our diverse political, cultural, and religious claims, but it will require us to develop even greater respect for our common humanity. The leaders here assembled can rewrite human history in the new millennium. If we have learned the lessons of the past, we can leave a very different legacy for our children. But we must believe the simple things, that everywhere, in every land, people in every station matter. Everyone counts, everyone has a role to play, and we all do better when we help each other. Thank you, and God bless you all.